We do.
Okay, great.
So I think the only Ledge Committee member I don't see is Michelle. Michelle, are you here? She said she would be here, but I don't know if she's having trouble.
There is one caller on here, but it doesn't have her name, and it would have her name on it.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I think we can get started unless anybody has any concerns about that. And we'll hope that Michelle can join us. So I'll call the Ledge Committee meeting to order at 10:04 a.m. Apologize for the little bit of a late start there. This meeting is being conducted in accordance with State of California Executive Order N-29-20 dated March 17, 2020. All members of the Legislative Committee of the Santa Clara-Santa Cruz County Roundtable are participating in this meeting by video conference with no physical meeting location. Members of the public wishing to observe the meeting live may do so via Zoom at the link provided in the agenda. As noted on the meeting agenda, members of the public may provide oral comments for all items during the public comment period by registering via the link provided in the agenda. And any emails received prior to 3 p.m. yesterday were forwarded to the committee. And I do believe meeting emails even received after that time were forwarded to the committee. And I'm hoping everyone on the committee had the opportunity to read those. Mr. Albertson, were there any other emails that were received like in the last hour? Or Andy?
I didn't get anything in the last hour, but oh well, there was one Steve sent this morning
Yep.
at 8 o'clock, and let me forward that to everyone right now.
Yeah, that was the last one that I had, Lisa.
Okay, great. So typically in Mountain View, we read those into the record if they're received after the deadline, but some of these are kind of long. And so I am hoping everyone on the committee had the opportunity to read them. And obviously they'll be part of the correspondence that we receive that's recorded on the website. In order to record attendance, if each Ledge Committee member could just say their name and the city they're from, that would be great.
Okay, Kathy Watanabe, City of Santa Clara.
Glenn Hendricks, Sunnyvale.
Lydia Koo, Palo Alto.
Ed Vodorf, Capitola.
And Lisa Matichak, Mountain View. So we have a quorum. We're just missing Michelle Wu. Okay. Next is item 3, which is oral communications. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wishing to address the committee on any matter that is not on the agenda. And speakers are allowed to speak on any topic for up to 2 minutes during this section, and state law prohibits the committee from acting on any of the non-agendized items. Is there any member of the public that wishes to speak on an item that is not on the agenda? And I see 3 hands. I'm not sure what order you guys raised your hands, but we'll start with Marie Jo, Ms. Fremont.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Marie Jo Fremont from Palo Alto. What I want to say is what this committee work on is as important as how the committee will do the work. So I would therefore encourage the committee to think about the most effective ways to influence legislation and regulations in a proactive manner. And in particular, I would recommend that this committee collaborate with the congressional offices, both the House and the Senate, because they have legislative expertise, and also with the San Francisco Roundtable Legislative Committee, because there is power in number. Leveraging resources and collaborating with others will help you be more efficient and more effective. And there's no need for this committee to do everything alone and reinvent the wheel. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Holbrook?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have two things. The first is a practical matter here. Usually I'm used to being able to see on my Zoom video all the participants and choose between that and focusing on one participant and the other participants being in small boxes. With the Zoom that I have in front of me, I can only see the person that's speaking and there's no option to see anybody else. I wonder if that can be addressed, and so we can have the normal choice that Zoom provides. The second thing is a comment. One of the things the Legislative Committee is tasked with is following the status of expansion plans. I can report that the San Jose City Council approved the expansion plan for San Jose Airport yesterday. I sat in on that meeting. In comments to the meeting, I noted that the growth assumption that they assumed would require the airport to grow at a rate of 2% and no more than that over the next, until 2037. That was consequential because if they had grown faster than that, they would have entered a world of gray in terms of their findings of no significance and or avoidability. But since their assumption was a 2% growth rate, as opposed to double-digit growth rates they've had over three of the last 4 years, they didn't have to do that analysis.
Thank you. You know what, I see that Michelle has joined us. Michelle, did you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Did you have any other comments other than to announce that you're here?
I was here. No, I don't. I was here earlier. Somehow there's some glitch, but I'm glad you found me. So I just to let you know that I'm here.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have Rowena Turner.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's all I wanted to know. I wanted to see if you could hear me.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And Jennifer from Sunnyvale.
Hi, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is probably independent to the legislative committee, but since the roundtable isn't meeting right now, I was just curious. I had heard that Cupertino had a vote and has decided to stay in the roundtable. I was wondering if there was a status for any of the other cities as far as that as well. Again, I don't know if it's practical to discuss this during the legislative meetings, but because the other meetings aren't taking place, I was just wondering if we could get a status on that as well, if possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see anyone else with their hand raised. Is there
Madam
anyone
Chair,
else? Yes.
it's Steve. Just to respond to Robert Holbrook's comment, at least on the version of Zoom that I have, there's a little box that says gallery view. And if you click on that, you can see everyone. I don't know if that's not the version that the folks in the audience have, but that's what I'm looking at.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see everyone.
And on YouTube, it's if you hit like mine says speaker view, if you click that on YouTube, it's showing all panelists. So there's probably an option, Robert, for you to check.
There isn't an option. I'm used to those options and they don't show on my screen. I think I'm going to log off and log back in and see if that fixes it.
Okay, thank you.
The option.
Wow, this is really sensitive there. Okay. Seeing nobody else from the public wishing to speak, we'll move on to item 4, and that is the just a quick review of the role of the legislative committee. And again, this is an information discussion item, and no action will be taken on this. Really, I wanted to put this on the agenda because I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the role and activities of this committee. And as you may recall from the work plan, this is a standing committee. So it's an ongoing committee of the Roundtable. And in that work plan, and I'm going to summarize here a few things, we are to actively review.
To me, if you don't mind, since we got it, and that's it.
We are to actively review and monitor proposed legislation and policy actions to reduce aircraft impacts on our communities. And this includes things like new rulemaking and the FAA reauthorization bill. We are also to advocate for changes in legislation and policies at the local, state, and federal level to reduce airplane noise and environmental impacts from airplanes. And this is both reacting to bills that have been introduced, as well as coming up proactively with bills on our own that we would then work with our federal or state representatives to get introduced. It's also the role of this committee is also to understand and recommend changes to FAA's procedure development and environmental review process. And this is all taken directly from our work plan and the strategic plan. And I just want to say that my interpretation of this is that any action that the legislative committee wants to do, such as write a letter or do advocating in person with our elected officials, we would run our proposals by the full roundtable, and they would provide input on that and either approve or disapprove those actions. But we had a discussion at the full roundtable about, how this would work, and we do want the full roundtable to be able to weigh in on any actions we might take. I do not think this says that the legislative committee needs to get approval from the roundtable to have meetings or to put items on our agenda, because obviously whatever we discuss or want to recommend would go to the full roundtable. So I view having our meetings and our agendas being something that we would set up, and then any action again run by the roundtable. And I guess I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And if somebody else has a different recollection of what the discussions were at the roundtable, that would be good to know. So are there any comments from members of the legislative committee on that? Mr. Hendricks.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I think I'm good with that recollection of where things are, but I wanted to kind of maybe expand the conversation about this a little bit. And is now the right time or not to talk about how we want to interact with members of Congress? Because I think our advocacy you mentioned right there needs to be more than we wrote a letter. I think we have an opportunity, I see at least one of our congressional representative people is on the phone, but I think once we come up with our strategy or ideas or things we're actually trying to see, being able to try and meet directly with our congressmen and senators and or their staff to really advocate our positions, I think that's going to be crucial. Otherwise, writing a letter is writing a letter. Then the other thing to what you mentioned about here, we'll take things back to the full roundtable. Could somebody think through sequencing and timing for me? So we'll meet and we've got a great advocacy idea, but we need to wait until the full roundtable before we can do it to then, take that input. It just seems the timing of us being able to be responsive. I'm not suggesting we say here, we don't want to get the full roundtable, but I think we need to think through how that timing and sequencing is actually going to look for us to have the nimbleness and responsiveness that we want to have. So maybe I asked more questions than I gave answers, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks. I should have added that there is in the work plan a statement that says there is an exception that if something is time critical and the legislative committee should do something about it, by exception, the chair of the roundtable can approve an action that we want to take. So, when we have the luxury of time, the full roundtable weighs in, but if we don't, then the chair can say yes or no to what we want to do. Any other comments from members of the committee? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. So I will open this up for public input, and I see three hands. Darlene Yapley.
Hi there.
Sorry, this is so sensitive to the touch here, but are you there?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Great. In the work plan, it states that 2.0 advocate for legislation and policies. And I would just like the committee to consider the airline bailout that's happening right now. I applaud that you've been responsive to the supersonic rules making, but I also want to flag that the $25 billion bailout in grants and loans to the airlines, United got $5 billion, American got $5.8 billion. Understandably, the funding is and should be for worker payroll, but it's also going to other things. And there's some things that we could advocate. For example, the vortex generators, refitting those on the Airbus 320s. Even maybe exploring night curfews with the FAA supporting the airlines. I mean, I know these are assertive, but a $25 billion bailout is quite unprecedented as well. So, these things are unusual, but I would like that to be considered as part of what is in the role of the legislative committee. And I do believe that this airline bailout is not over. I expect more activity to happen. So if we don't ask our congressionals to keep this in mind, we won't get it. So the nation is helping the airline industry. Perhaps we citizens can also get some benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer from Sunnyvale.
My apologies.
I think we can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry about that, Lisa. I did not mean to. If I raised my hand, I didn't mean to. My
okay,
apologies.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. No worries. Marie Jo.
Thank you. So I have three suggestions for the committee as first operational steps based on the role that Lisa reviewed. So on the task about tracking legislation regulation, as I indicated in my April 26 email to the roundtable, I would recommend for this committee to obtain from Steve Iverson or the congressional staff members a status update on the 10 noise-related section of the 2018 FAA reauthorization bill. I gave a summary of the sections in my email. And this update should specify what progress, if any, has been made, and specifically whether reports, if applicable, have been published. And then this committee can build on the status update and then identify specific actions to take on the various items. On the task 2.2 about new legislation and regulations, I would recommend for the committee to create a list of items that have been discussed by the roundtable over the last year, for instance, metrics or other things, and that the topics that relate to legislation and regulations. And I would suggest that for each item to capture the essence of the problem and then list the current relevant laws and rules, because then the committee could use the list to discuss later at future meetings how to best address these issues. And the third suggestion about the FA procedure development and environmental review process, again, I would recommend for the committee to create a summary of the issues with the current processes, using again the information that the FA provided at past meetings, and perhaps Steve can extract the critical issues from the previous presentations and discussions, and then the committee can use that summary to discuss possible or desired changes at future meetings and discuss that with congressional members. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more, actually a couple more maybe. Mr. Holbrook.
Yeah, a couple things. I'd like to underscore what Commissioner Hendricks suggested, which is the legislative committee needs to be prepared to respond in a timely way. And that may not allow time to get back to the roundtable to get approval on things. And so I think it's important to understand the urgency of items and acquire the appropriate authorizations in advance of action being required. And that may require a little bit of thinking. It also might require the second thing that I'm going to suggest, which is that it would be really good to develop a calendar of upcoming legislation, reports from the FAA for the Reauthorization Act, deadlines for comment that the FAA is looking for, both for NPRMs and procedural changes that they're introducing. And I think we'd find that that was quite useful in helping to prioritize trade off urgency and importance, and also to get the necessary authority from the roundtable as a whole for actions that the committee might need to take on a exceptional and urgent basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd just like to add one other thing, which is I still can't see the gallery view, and neither can a colleague of mine who's in the public.
Okay, we'll work on that one. And then we have one more, Mr. Pike.
Sorry for the delay. Yeah, thank you for forging ahead with these issues and these difficult times. This is Tom Pike with Congressman Khanna's office. I did want to underscore that thanks for some of that public input that came in. I think it would be great if the legislative committee could basically convey the asks of both the representatives and the constituents. For example, Mary Jo's raising about the updates on the 2018 FAA reauthorization bill and what's going on with the noise elements there. I do want to say basically our congressional office at this point is just working 100% on COVID related things, whether it's healthcare or economic impact or the ramifications on our casework, because we already have an existing casework load of over 200. So we're really jammed at the moment, but so the point is I'm not being very proactive on this, but it would be great if we had kind of a list of things that you would like from our congressional offices, and then I can push forward on that and try to get responses and additional information. So thanks again, and I will be on this call until probably about 11. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other members of the public with their hand raised. So I'll go back to the committee. Lydia. Oh, wait. Sorry. Lydia?
Oh, I thought you said wait.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. So are airport expansions and their EIR process within our scope for the Ledge Committee? I mean, I think they should be, so maybe that's something to put on the notes to consider.
Yep, I don't think that was specifically called out in the work plan.
Okay.
But from my perspective, an EIR that's done as part of expansion plans is something that is a rule, a legislation, and so I think it does fall.
But it's just something to consider if we could kind of take that into on the notes. And then also, I'm so glad that Mr. Pike is here, but I'm also, so thank you for being here. I'm also wondering if there's any, if we could reach out to see if airports or more congressional staff might be in attendance, and how would we kind of have them help us put together legislation, because obviously, you know, they have the know-how. So is there a way to kind of find out what would their roles and responsibilities be with our committee, in interacting with our committee? So those were just the two questions I wanted to add.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. You know what would be really helpful is if members of this committee could do their own raising and lowering of the hands and muting and unmuting. That would be awesome. And I'll just call on you. So, Mr. Hendricks.
Okay, so thank you. So again, I'm not sure this is the right time right here, but given all the comments of what I've just heard, it sounds like if I was to make a list of all the legislative items that are out there right now, there'd be dozens and dozens of things. And, you know, given the comment that came from Mr. Pike, you know, Congress, they have a bunch of other things. So how do can we be more focused on what we're doing? I don't think we should try and comment on every piece of legislation that's out there. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure I want to respond to pieces of legislation that are out there. I would love to talk about what is it that we need to see that our congressional representatives need to be pushing forward in terms of legislation changes. You know, just my own thought is the number one thing is we need to get the FAA, the Congress, to require the FAA to take into account the impact of air noise on the ground and farther than just 2 miles away from the airport. Until that fundamental change happens, the FAA doesn't care about what we're doing. And so us commenting on, you know, the reauthorization letter, unless that's the tool that Congress uses to do what we're asking them to do, or I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to affect anything about what's going to be part of the bailout money for airlines and things like that. We can have nice discussions about them, but that's not going to be able to translate into real work that our Congress people can take and put into legislation. I don't think we have to actually write the legislation. We need to define the concepts that we want our legislative people to push forward, and they're the experts at finding the right place to put those tools or those concepts into legislative action. So I don't know if I've got the right or the wrong perspective on it, but that's what I'd love to be able to understand. Because if we're going to try and go through here, there's a list of, you know, 35 pieces of legislation, and we need to go through and line by line say something about them. I don't think that's the best use of our time. I'd rather just go back to the whole roundtable and say, hey, you know, anything that causes, you know, noise for the public, we should just be able to write a letter, we're against it. I mean, you know, what I want to talk about is what are the specific concepts we need to get, which are new concepts, we need to get into the legislative world for Congress to move forward. So I don't know if now is the right or the wrong time, but that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you. I think maybe what we should do is have this discussion when we talk about future agenda items for this group. I've been taking notes of the items that have been raised, and let's have the discussion about how we prioritize those toward the end. Okay, any other comments on item 4? Okay, seeing no hands raised, let's move on to item 5, which is the primary reason we called this meeting. And I hope everyone has had a chance to read the documents that were in the packet and have also had the opportunity to read the public input that has been forwarded. And just a quick recap for where we are. So the FAA has issued their proposal for the rule for noise certification for supersonic airplanes. And this is Lisa's summary. In a nutshell, they're proposing the same methodology that has been used for subsonic airplanes in terms of the locations where noise is measured, and then the summing of those three numbers to get a score, if you will. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand the methodologies and the measurements and how it translates into a rule. And up to and including stage 3, the rule stated requirements for each of the 3 locations where you measure noise. But starting with the stage 4, the requirements are expressed as a limit to the sum of those 3 measurements. And that's a gross simplification of what this is, because there's a lot more details and some wiggle room, and but the ultimate number is the sum of the 3 measurement points. So every time a new noise requirement has been introduced in the past, it has become more restrictive in terms of the amount of noise the airplane can make. And that's expressed in the effective perceived noise in decibels. And stage 4 and stage 5, as I mentioned, are just one number. They're going down. And the rule that the FAA is proposing is that score, and it's halfway between stages 4 and stages 5. And from my perspective, that's a step back because we would be allowing more noise for supersonic airplanes than subsonic airplanes. So the roundtable previously said that the noise certification regulations should be less than stage 5 in the letter that was written in November of 2019. So that's just a quick recap. So I guess I'd like to hear initial thoughts from the committee members, and then we'll open this up for public input. Glenn?
Okay, so, I read through all the stuff that came here, and it appears, I want to be clear what we're talking about when we say supersonic. And, Steve can correct me if I don't repeat this correctly, but I believe the reporter, the write-up they have says they're still not going to allow supersonic air travel over US mainland. The issue and the noise of what we're talking about has to do with how much noise is allowed from the engines at primarily takeoff, but we'll say takeoff and landing. Because the issue is to get an efficient supersonic engine that's at altitude, it's not as efficient and it's more noisy at takeoff and landing. And so by what I read in here, the issue of why they want to have different rules is because the aircraft engine technology is not good enough right now today to be efficient at the altitude and at the takeoff and landing piece. So the thing we're talking about is not sonic booms. It has to do with how much noise is allowed when planes take off and land. And rather than getting into all their measurements and stuff, I believe our advocacy there should be no change in what is, or no louder change that should be allowed for a supersonic engine at takeoff time. Just because industry doesn't have the technology to make an efficient, altitude engine and one that's quiet at takeoff and landing, doesn't mean we should just change the rules and say that's okay. I mean, the example I would use is the nuclear power industry. If they said, we can make a very efficient nuclear power plant, but we're not going to be very good with the shielding, and so it's going to leak some radiation. Can we just change the rules so that's okay? And that's the example of what I think is they're asking for. And so, not to get into bog down all the FAA's technology, our advocacy should just be is that supersonic aircraft, yeah, we don't want supersonic flight over mainland US, and those engines should be no less noise efficient than any other aircraft engines that are flying. And to me, that's how simple we need to do it. Everybody else can figure out how to translate that into their language, but that's the goal, that's the objective, that's the success criteria that we believe a supersonic program should operate with. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Lydia.
I have some questions first, if we could work with that. And I don't know if you can answer it or not, or if Steve might be able to. But my concerns on the rule is how does the FAA proposed standards comply with the international standards? The certification levels must be equal to or better than the international ICAO standards when they become available. But when will they become available? And also, the new supersonic airplanes must kind of follow the international standards within a certain time frame. So can we find out when is that certain time frame? And then also, they're also subject to the curfews and penalties, right? Will there be penalties and curfews if the timeline is not met? So I think that's a question that I'd like to have given to us so we can understand, if they don't follow that.
I can help out a little bit here. So this is Steve Alverson. And currently, Lydia, the US is going it alone on this. That FAA presentation that you saw, that's a part of the packet, was made to the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, CAPE. That's a part of the International Civil Aviation Organization that you mentioned, ICAO. And it was to basically roll out the concept of this supersonic noise certification for a certain group of aircraft. The international community is not interested in this. They don't want to, at this point, have noise certification or emission standards for these aircraft. So we would basically be going this alone for the time being. So there are no greater standards to be met on an international level. It would be all US standards. And in terms of any compliance with penalties, assuming that there are airports that do have certain limits or curfews, these aircraft would be subject to those local restrictions just like any other aircraft would. But right now, the US and FAA is going it alone. And just a reminder that this is being done at the request of Congress. Congress has asked the FAA to develop these noise certification standards because there are manufacturers out there who want to get these aircraft built and out to market.
Well, that's disturbing. If my understanding is a lot of the European countries, their DNL is even lower, than United States. And so, I was kind of really hoping, as what Glenn had said, that, that the noise should be lower than what we have standards for today, or at a minimum at stage 5. So it's kind of worrisome. But so why did the FAA reinterpret the rules on noise limits to not include the supersonic planes?
Yeah, and when we discussed this back in October, first off, the FAA's charge comes from Congress, as I had mentioned. It was a part of the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. So Congress said that you will, FAA, work to set these new standards for supersonic aircraft because there are manufacturers that want to get them out to market. And the reason that the FAA has to do that is that there are currently no supersonic noise certification standards in our current regs. Essentially, the only ones that are there apply to only one aircraft type, and that's the Concorde, which of course is no longer commercially flying. And so that's why the FAA is doing this work. That's why they're attempting to put a standard in place. And to the point that Glenn raised earlier, it is in part a result of aircraft engine noise. These aircraft will require much more thrust, but it's also the fact that because of their sleek and streamlined shape to fly supersonically, those wings have much less lift. So they need much more thrust to take off. So unlike a conventional aircraft like a 777 that has high lift wings and can get off the runway quickly, these aircraft have very low lift, narrow wings and need much more power on takeoff to get off the ground. And that's why the FAA has stepped back from the stage 5 noise standards in order to be able to accommodate the way these aircraft will perform on the ground.
Thanks, Steve.
You bet.
So when you're talking about the noise and getting off and their wingspan, so it brings me to my question about they're proposing changes to measuring the noise certification levels, but they keep measuring the noise levels only at the airport. And then they'll continue to allow the use of these certified noise levels anywhere under the flight path. So I have concerns if they're only measuring at the airport. I mean, they're still flying over the land area. So we would want to know what is their noise levels all the way through, right?
So yeah, ideally, we would all love to know what they do after they leave the 3 points. And let me remind everybody what those points are. This is within 14 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Part 36. It's where aircraft get certified for airworthiness, not only noise, but other types of flight performance. And for noise, the measurements, and this has happened ever since this part of Part 36 was put in place, the noise is measured at 3 locations, one on approach, one sideline of the aircraft, and one on departure. And that's the way it works for every single aircraft. Once that one aircraft is certified and meets the FAA's requirement, that certification applies to every aircraft that's manufactured after that. And as you said, Lydia, we only know what those noise levels are at those 3 points. Once it leaves there, noise levels can and theoretically will go up. There's an important aspect of this proposed rulemaking, and that is a programmed lapse rate. It's called the PLR. And it's basically an auto throttle that will be in these aircraft that will allow, once the aircraft leaves the ground, to reduce the throttle settings automatically using a computer to reduce those noise levels. And then once it's past that certification point, those noise levels can increase again. Now, on the good news side, that should help communities near airports have reduced noise levels from this aircraft if that happens on every flight. And that's the idea, that this won't be a pilot activated system. It will be an automatic system that will kick in. On the bad news side, at some point, that system will turn off and noise will go back up again further down. And we don't know what those noise exposure levels would be. And that would be something I think would be important for the roundtable and the rest of the community to know.
Thank you. You know, it's just very concerning to me that, you know, the measurements are only within their contours, when we know that even on the stage 5 airplanes, you know, we experience their noise all the way, you know, over here. And then, you know, we have the ones in Los Altos Hills. It's experienced further than within the contours. So I would like to see that we advocate, you know, to measure the noise further away, not within the contours, that we should be pushing back and kind of having measurements of noise throughout. other thing, I forgot my question, but I'll remember
Come
it
back to you.
later. Thank you. Thanks,
I'll be
Lisa.
here until noon.
Okay.
Let's see if anybody else. It doesn't look like anyone else on the committee has their hand up. So
Ed has his hand up.
He does? Okay, Ed. I don't see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Hi, and I have one comment too, whenever it's possible. Jennifer Landisman. Or is that for the
we'll open
committee
it
right now,
up for
or
public input
comment?
in a minute.
Thank you, thank you.
So Ed.
Okay, Glenn, thank you for noticing my hand, and Lisa, thank you. I'm going to go along with how Lisa started this. This is my first legislative committee. I found this document very confusing. So bear with me as I try to go through it. Also, to Glenn's point, when you try to just make it very succinct, I think, the reason we're here is that we don't want to have any increase in noise that's allowed. When I read the document, they started talking about, the cumulative noise. And I think they made a point here that they expect that during the LTO sequence, that there could be an increase of up to 10 decibels for the cumulative thing. And it kind of goes against what we're saying, but the FAA says we're going to give them latitude while they're testing. Okay, so I don't know what that means, because I think the real simple point to adhere to is, we understand. I think Glenn made a good point that these supersonics are meant to fly fast up to 1.8 and be streamlined. The weakness is the landing and takeoff because of the way they're designed. And they are going to make more noise because of more thrust. And the other one, maybe Steve, you can weigh in on this, because I'm not sure if I understand. On page 14 of the document, they talk about VNRS. And this, I'm not too familiar with the system, but it talks to about as a way of verifying, the noise that's allowed. But in one section, it says, VNRS is not required. And I'm thinking, this sounds like a great system, but it's not required. So if we're going to advocate for anything from a legislative committee, it's like, I think this should be a required part of what they do. And I'm just kind of interested to hear your thoughts on that, Steve.
Yes, Ed, you're right. If the aircraft do have this variable noise reduction system, which is what VNRS stands for, it should be a part of the entire aircraft fleet when they are put into service. So it shouldn't just be for certification. It should be a part of the way that the aircraft is manufactured and that it's used on every flight. The key is to not have it be something that the pilots can choose to use or not use. It needs to be built into the systems, and that's something that certainly the committee could advocate for.
Great, thank you. That was the only thing that I say. As to Glenn's point again, there are so many things that we could comment on, and I would rather be specific on ones that actually have an impact on what we're doing. We started off with, we could write letters about everything, but this is one of those items where I feel like this definitely makes a difference. It's something that will affect us. If I was going to take a position on, there might be a few that we are, but this is one that I think is worth standing up for. So thank you for that explanation, Steve.
Thanks, Ed. Before I go back to Lydia, I just want to add that I think it's always important to pick your battles. And there are many, many, many things that we could be focused on, but I would also like to focus on the ones that we think will have the biggest impact. And when we comment, I tend to like to stick to whatever is before the group that we're commenting to. So, we're specifically talking about supersonic noise at this point at the airport. And so I feel like I'd kind of like to stick to that instead of adding things like, well, we don't want noise over when they're flying over land, because really they're only focused right now on certifying the noise at the airport. Although I will quickly add that I think it is important when it comes to the VNRS and the PLR, that I'm a little bit concerned that while they might use those for certification of the noise, I don't see anything that says they there's no way they can't turn those off, so to speak, when they actually go into operation of the airplane, or when do they turn those off? And so maybe we want to comment on they need to be, it needs to automatically be kept in place until the planes reach a certain altitude, or something along those lines, so that it's not left up to the discretion of the pilots to turn them on and off. That kind of concerns me. And I do think we should stick with the current categories, the stages, and not create a new one for supersonic planes. I see Lydia's hand up again. So Lydia, before I go to public input, Lydia, did you have another comment?
Yes, I remembered what I was going to say, but I still have a question after what Ed had asked. I wanted to find out the VNRS, is that for both descending for arrivals as well as departures, or is that just for takeoffs?
Takeoffs.
Just takeoffs. So, okay, thank you. So, you know, so then we kind of have to address when the arrivals are also, and my other thing was also to ask, why did the FAA not say anything about the ANCA? ANCA, and does it not apply to the supersonic planes?
So in short, no, ANCA doesn't apply to supersonic aircraft. ANCA was a broad measure that essentially, in a trade-off for getting rid of stage 2 aircraft and making sure that there were just stage 3 and then ultimately now 4 and 5 aircraft in the fleet, that to do that, to get the airlines to buy those aircraft, they limited the airport proprietors' ability to put restrictions in at their airports. So ANCA was not an aircraft specific type of legislation. It was basically an airport type of legislation that limited airport proprietors' ability to put in restrictions. So once ANCA went into effect, every new aircraft type that came out after that, whether the community likes it or whether the airport likes it, essentially can operate at that airport as long as it meets stage 3 or higher noise standards. And this proposal indicates that these aircraft would, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, they would be somewhere between stage 4 and stage 5 noise levels.
Okay. My last comment, thank you for indulging me. I was thinking that, you know, I know that we're Santa Clara County and Santa Cruz County, but I think that, you know, San Francisco Airport, the takeoffs and the booms that happens with these aircrafts, it would be very beneficial for us to be also working closely with the San Francisco Roundtable and their ledge committee, so we can leverage off each other. I know Millbrae has great concerns about the backblast noise, so this would be certainly something that they'll be looking into too. Thank you.
Thank you. So I also see some hands raised from folks who are on the committee, but for some reason, they're not listed as being part of the committee. So Kathy, did you have some comments?
Can you hear me, Lisa?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I hope you cannot see me. I just had surgery on Friday and I'm still recovering, so I'm not looking my best. So, but anyway, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I just wanted to just address my concerns with this, with the proposal, and I'm glad that we are addressing it, because and I feel as a roundtable and as a legislative committee, we do have to address it. You know, we are talking about airport noise. This is going to impact airport noise. I'm glad Mr. Holbrook brought up about the San Jose had discussed the airport expansion yesterday. We as a city had submitted our concerns, and to the CEQA during the CEQA period. And when we saw what was proposed yesterday, a lot of our concerns were not addressed. And so we as a city have had to follow up as a result. And just based on that alone, taking into consideration that the San Jose is looking to grow by 2%. I realize over a period of years, and if supersonic supersonic planes are a part of this process, I mean, if we're already having issues just getting commercial airlines to just make less noise, have less impact on communities, I'm really concerned with the impact that supersonics will have, even if we are looking at, stage 4, stage 5 noise levels. I think it's something that we as a legislative body, as well as a roundtable, need to be aware of, have the FAA follow up with us, and so that we can continue to advocate on behalf of just our communities. I remember when the presentation was made to us last October, and I mean, I think supersonic, it's very exciting, but when we already know the difficulties we have just trying to mitigate airplane noise in the air as well as on the ground, I'm just concerned that if we just don't continue, if we don't stay on top of this, that it's going to have an even greater impact, and any leverage or any movement that we've had in terms of getting noise mitigation in place is just going to, we're just going to lose that leverage. And so we really need to stay on top of this issue as it goes forward. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to remind folks who are calling in rather than logging into Zoom that if you do *6, that toggles your mute and unmute, and *9 is what you use to raise your hand. I also see a member of the roundtable with her hand up, and I believe let's see. I think Rowena, because you're not part of the Ledge Committee, but part of the roundtable, for this one, we do consider you part of the public, but we're ready for public input. So there's a couple hands up, and Rowena, why don't we start with you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I have a question here. Do we have plans for the supersonic aircraft for San Francisco and San Jose, or is it just going to be San Francisco? And then my second question would be, in terms of destination, will it be international oceanic destination, or would it also include domestic destinations in the United States? Thank you.
Thanks. So Steve, I don't know if you can comment on those questions.
Yeah, I can, Lisa. I didn't know if you wanted to have interaction during the public comments or take all the public comments and I can respond to it. It's your call.
I think it's helpful for all of us to have answers kind of as we go along. So I'm fine with
you bet.
You responding. We just can't take action on it.
Yeah, so the short answer is, Rowena, we don't know. These aircraft, just like any other manufactured aircraft, will be able to use any airport that they want to use and whenever they want to use them, consistent with the local rules and regulations. So we simply just don't know where they're going to go and operate. The expectation is because they want to fly supersonically and they can't do it over the U.S. mainland, that these will be primarily transoceanic flights, probably flights from SFO and San Jose, going across the Pacific, and on the East Coast from New York, Atlanta, Miami, across the Atlantic Ocean. But at this point, that information is not available, and it's up to the people who buy these aircraft to decide where and how they want to fly them.
Thanks, Steve.
You bet.
Next, I can't tell what order folks raised their hand, but Darlene, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes. How the FAA is doing noise certification for the supersonic is a problem. And the certification standard for the planes are just at the airport, which means very loud. We cannot allow these noise levels right at the airport to be used for the entire flight path. So if you look under the hood of what's written in this rules, is that they're saying that the noise certification that's done at the airport is the standard that can be used anywhere on the entire flight path. Anywhere on the entire flight path. That is just like we are all experiencing the same level of noise at the airport. The FAA is also talking about single event noise. And so if we think the noise level is unacceptable now, it is going to be worse. And because the current DNL metric averages noise over 24 hours, the FAA will be able to declare that there's no significant impact with this noise, and therefore we can't do anything about it. So it's been great to hear Steve's insights. I think we need to really rely on his expertise, because the new noise standards must be created to protect communities inside and outside of the 65 DNL contour. You can't take one standard right at the airport and allow it to be anywhere. It can't be based on a 24-hour average. If they have a small number of planes, we're still going to have a big problem. And that they must meet the noise criteria, as Glenn mentioned, as the subsonic aircraft.
Thank you. Marie Jo?
Can you? Oh. So what I would like to say is that this new rule that they are proposing, it's all based on the conclusion that the FAA made in 2018 that the 14 CFR Part 36 does not apply to supersonic airplanes. And you need to challenge that decision because, number one, this FAA conclusion reverses the position that they held for decades. And number two, this new rule, which allows for higher noise level than for supersonic airplanes, that new rule contradicts the FAA stated goal in this 2018 memo that they would not certify supersonic planes or allow them to operate if they did not meet the standard that would be applicable to the subsonic planes at the time. So I would encourage you to read what I sent you, that 2018 FAA memo that I sent to the Roundtable last night, but let me give you a quick history. The conclusion they made reverses what they have been saying for 30 years about that supersonic airplanes should be subjected to the same standard as subsonic. So in 1990, they proposed a new rule to say that should meet stage 3 noise level. In 94, they withdrew the rule, but then they stated that any future, and I'm quoting, any future supersonic aircraft would be expected to produce no greater noise impact on the community than a subsonic airplane certified to stage 3 noise limits, end of quote. In 2008, when the subsonic noise certification standard went to stage 4, the FAA reiterated at the time that, and I quote, the latest noise limit in Part 36 is stage 4, which applies to the development of future supersonic airplanes operating at subsonic speeds, end of quote. So furthermore, in that memo, they stated, and here's the quote, the FAA goal is not to certificate or permit to operate in the US any future design supersonic transport that does not meet standards then applicable to subsonic airplanes. So I would encourage you to challenge this rule because they're using a justification that they're not following, in fact, or reversing a position that they have had for 30 years, plus not meeting the stated goal that they included in that conclusion, I think is not legally valid. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Landesman.
Thank you. And thank you to the committee for doing this really important work. I wanted, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to make sure that everybody distinguishes the 65 DNL threshold of significance for NEPA purposes from the noise reduction for equipment, because FAA plays some mind games with this, which is that they talk about noise regarding the equipment and the machinery and certification of the equipment. And then they have very permissive standards for how they address community noise issues. And in fact, we are literally, there are no standards, so there are no protections. I really want to thank Mr. Hendricks for his comments, because the best you can do for people is to advocate on the basis that there's a fundamental flaw. And there are laws that were changed in 2018 to review precisely all the problems that FAA has with their metrics, with their methods, with everything. And it's based on the failures that were identified in their implementation of NextGen. They really are not in a position to be making new rules at this point. The select committee provided these recommendations. I sent them to you in an email. And I think it's incumbent upon you to reflect what the public has asked you to speak up on our behalf. Because if you just stay in the weeds of what the FAA confines you to, that's exactly what they did with ANCA, which was really pretty much a deal with the devil. So I think it's really important for you to speak broadly and fight like hell on these issues. And definitely the 2018 reauthorization is something to build on. These are not bills that are being proposed. These are laws that were passed. It took 5 years to get those laws on, to be passed. So I think it's really important, and the select committee helped inform those laws. So that would be my comment, to make it a very broad statement. And I would ask for Steve to kind of maybe explain the difference between what we're talking about in terms of equipment, machinery, and certification versus how FAA manages noise reduction, which they don't. How FAA manages noise. That's
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Mr. Holbrook?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a lot to say. Let me see what I can do in 2 minutes. First, the FAA has had a longstanding policy, at least since '78, of ensuring that future SSTs are subject to the same noise levels of subsonic aircraft. What we're going to have to help them around in our recommendation, if we choose to encourage stage 5 criteria to be met, is the language in the reauthorization bill that instructed the administrator to respond to requests by manufacturers for subsonic airplanes by coming up with standards that are practicable for that aircraft type. Now, we know that stage 5 is practicable. It gets a little dicier when you're talking about practicable for supersonic. So that's something that I think our recommendation could founder on if we don't address it in advance. The second point is regarding ANCA. ANCA took away the ability for airports to limit the kinds of airplanes that fly there. I would suggest that if the FAA proceeds to allow airplanes that are less than the current standard for subsonic to be certified, that they use their discretion to enable local airport operators to deny service to airplanes that don't meet the stage 5 standards. The third point has to do with the very and perhaps most important point about the noise being measured at the airport. I would suggest that we advocate that the thrust of the VNRS and PLR systems should not be allowed to exceed the thrust used at the measurement point until the airplane gets past an altitude of 10,000 feet. I have more to say on that, but I'm out of time.
Thank you. And we have Jennifer from Sunnyvale.
Hi, Lisa. Yes, can you folks hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First, I wanted to kind of reiterate what other folks have said, that supersonic should under no circumstances have standards that are less than subsonic planes. So right now we're at stage 5, so any supersonic would meet that. If they move to stage 6, then any new supersonic should meet stage 6, period, no exceptions. The other thing, of course, is no sonic booms over land and nothing perceived. In other words, what I'm saying is no rattling, nothing that would differentiate a supersonic from a subsonic on land. The auto throttle that Steve was talking about, this variable noise reduction system, is very concerning. And what Darlene was saying has me very concerned as well, in that the standards are only at airports, and we need to be cognizant of that. Because what that means is places like Palo Alto or Sunnyvale, where we're farther from the airport, could have noise as bad as right at the runways. And if the FAA, we're in the catbird seat to a certain extent right now, in that there are regulations that pretty much ban supersonic right now over the US. We need to make sure that we're strong here. If they cannot meet these standards and make sure that everything's fine here and that the perceived noise is nothing greater than a subsonic, then we need to say they cannot enter the metroplexes. They cannot fly over. They need to be over 70 miles away, period. The FAA is going to kind of skirt things. We need to be cognizant. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other members of the public wishing to address the committee.
Lisa, can you hold on 1 second and just let me make sure if there is
Sure.
anyone else, because I'm receiving all sorts of messages from people that the controls for them are not the same. And I've been, my apologies to everyone. I've been online trying to figure out if it's something on the setup of the webinar, but I am not finding anything. So I just want to make sure that if there is somebody else that wants to speak and we can't see it, that they
How would
can
we know
speak.
that?
Look,
send
I'm
a
trying to
chat?
see. Bert, are you? Oh, here, let's. Is there anyone else? I just am going through the attendees by person by person, just to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any hands. I made sure that all their. Okay, sorry for that little.
No worries. We want to make sure we hear from everybody. Okay, so let's go back to the committee. I certainly appreciate all the good questions and input we've received. I want to make sure we get through this as well as the future agenda items, and where I know some people have dropped off because the county was having a press conference at 11 o'clock today regarding COVID-19. I guess I'm going to take a stab at what I think are the main messages that we would recommend the roundtable include in our communications to regarding this proposed rule. And I'm hearing that the FAA should stick with their previous stated direction to require supersonic planes to meet the same requirements as subsonic planes. And that means that the stage 5 limits need to be met, and that really there's no need to create a new category. That said, we think there should be new noise standards that are defined, and that noise should be measured not just at the airport, but beyond the airport. And that we would require that the VNRS and PLR, if they are used for certification, there needs to be a way to have them used until an airplane reaches maybe 10,000 feet in altitude, because we are concerned about them being turned off as soon as you're past that last measurement, and the planes could still be flying at a level that would create a lot of noise over neighborhoods until they reach maybe 10,000 feet. But Steve, it'd be good to have your input on that. To me, those were the main points that I heard specifically regarding this rule. If folks want to broaden it, we should talk about that. I personally think that there would be a different approach to trying to influence a lot of the other topics that came up, and not necessarily as part of this proposed rulemaking. But I'd love to hear from my colleagues here. So again, I'm sorry, I can't tell what order you raised your hand. Glenn?
Well, Lydia was actually first, but I'll just go ahead and go.
Oh, sorry.
I like the strategy of the way you said here, let's define success criteria and not try and get too bogged down in their technology. You had the first bullet of saying here, you don't need a new criteria, existing rules happen. And then you talked about, we want to see an expansion of where things are measured. I actually think that might be better as a separate topic. I mean, we could send it all as part of this, but that's really that's not really part of this thing, because it applies to all aircraft. So I like the concept of what you're saying. As I said, I think the success criteria is really good. As a separate thing, not in advocacy to the FAA, but I think we should send a question and challenge our congressional representatives for why are they encouraging the FAA to incentivize manufacturers to move forward with more lax air noise standards. I mean, as it was mentioned from Steve, the Congress is the one who's asked the FAA to look at creating these different set of rules. I can speculate as to why that is and what that means for economic development and stuff, but I think that's a separate question to kind of challenge our congressional people at. And then I was going back through and I was reading the document here, and I just wanted to highlight, there's a piece on page 15 of the document that goes back to my comment when I was first talking about it's a problem with technology, that it's not quite there yet. This is in the last paragraph or so on page 15. And it says, for example, NASA ran one alternative projection for an engine with a higher bypass ratio and second alternative projection for incorporating noise or nozzle chevrons as a noise reduction technology to the original low bypass ratio engine. In both cases, NASA found the alternative technologies reduced the effective perceived noise level, but came with a reduction in the flight range of the aircraft. And to me, that's where I get to, technologies could exist to be able to deal and address noise. The problem is there's a corresponding issue with what it means for aircraft weight or distance or other performance characteristics. So that's where I think it's really important. We should, to your first point, Lisa, set the success criteria that those aircraft have to be as no more noisy than existing aircraft. That should be our standard, and maybe even less noisy would be better. And that it can be done, they just have to define what the trade-offs are that they want the manufacturing community to work within, which again goes back to this, why is Congress telling the FAA to create rules that don't do that? So that's a long way of saying I agree with what you said.
Lydia.
So I thank you for providing the outline of what we're going to go back, what the committee is going to go back with. But I wanted to ask, if I may, Steve, I agree with what Glenn said also in terms of challenging, the FAA with the the 14 CFR Part 36, but also challenging the congressionals, in terms of, why are we doing this? As a matter of fact, when we were talking about all this, I was thinking, if you can't make it less noise or at minimum at the stage 5, then you shouldn't be even building it in the first place. But I wanted to ask Steve, so how, in his opinion, how can we challenge the 2018 FAA conclusion that 14 CFR Part 36 does not apply to supersonics? I mean, what's a way for you to guide us in terms of how can we challenge that?
Yeah, I think that we heard a lot of good public testimony on that, and some folks like Mary Jo sent a lot of information in that provides specific references that the committee could point to in their preparation or response to be considered by the roundtable. So I think my approach would be to mine that information and then include it in either a letter or whatever the committee is going to put together for the roundtable to consider.
Okay, and in the letter, I would like to also ask to make sure that we include the technical language so that, for the PLR, it doesn't get turned off and so forth. Besides that, I think Lisa had summed it up very well, so thank you. Those were all my points too.
Thanks. So I've added to the list, including the information Marie Jo sent, challenging why it's concluded that this doesn't apply to supersonic. And also, we could also say in there that airports could deny service to supersonic flights if they don't meet the stage 5 requirements, as if some airports would be willing to enforce that. Okay.
Lisa?
Yes.
May I also add one more, what Mr. Holbrook said about, if they're not using ANCA, then local control should prevail, and airports prohibit if they want to. Can we kind of challenge that also and try to get that in there?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So Glenn, your hand is up. Is that just left over?
You're on mute, Glenn.
The button that says I'm unmuting doesn't unmute. Okay, great. So yeah, I wanted to respond to these things that were just added. I think we're expanding the scope. This thing that says here, let's add something that says airports could deny these kind of flights if they don't meet certain standards. What airport's going to do that? An airport, if they can get these kind of new aircraft in that lets them have these longer routes faster, they're going to say yes. It's a great idea, but it's also, it's not to the meat of what we're trying to do right here. And now we're getting into not just talking about standards for aircraft that take off and landing. We want to expand the scope into this, into giving new powers to airports. I think that's the wrong thing to try and add into this. If we should stay very focused, I like what you first said here. Mr. and Mrs. whoever's reading this, don't let them be louder. Mr. and Mr. who's ever reading this, we need to change and expand the measurement of how we look at noise. If we try and go off into all the other weeds, we're going to give every person who's reading this, a congressman, the FAA people, or anybody else, a reason to go ahead and drag the conversation to some other way. Let's stay focused and narrow on what we're trying to get achieved. We might want to take and send advocacy letters about those topics separately, but I don't think they should be included in this. They actually diminish the first message that you were talking about. Just my 2 cents.
Thanks.
Hey, Lisa.
Yes.
May I please add one comment? And
absolutely.
Having done this for many years and seeing the way this works, Glenn's is very on point. What the FAA is interested in is getting comments about what's written in their NPRM. So if it's in the NPRM, it's fair game to comment. If it's not, then it's probably best to do it in another way and do that, either through other letters, that type of thing. God bless you, Patty. We could certainly do that and include it, but it basically will be ignored because it's not specific to the issue here.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That was a good discussion. I also, as someone who gets a lot of public input before a council meeting, I definitely focus on comments that are on point to whatever topic we're discussing, and reserve the rest for maybe later. So I'm fine with being very targeted and focused in our message and input on this. So how to move forward? I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm happy to do a first draft of our input. I sure would like someone else to work with me on this. And Steve, would you be able to do that? I think I saw a head nod.
Yeah, I'm just searching for the unmute button. Yes, I would be happy to help.
Okay. And then, let's see, I don't know if we can run this by the committee before it goes to the roundtable. I think I can send it out so you see it before. And I guess if you have individual comments, you could contact me, but we want to be careful about the Brown Act violations. But I'm assuming the roundtable is going to have a meeting in May sometime. I think that's what we're shooting for. So we should have this before that meeting. And I will contact the chair of the roundtable to ask if this can be on the agenda for that meeting. Okay, any other comments on this topic?
At least a standard approach, and we've used at the full roundtable, is to have the committee essentially authorize you as chair to write the position of the committee, and then that way you don't necessarily have to recirculate it back through the committee and have multiple iterations of it.
Okay. Looks like Glenn has his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to also ask, here we're legislative advocacy, and what I heard is we're going to write a draft of a letter and try and respond to the FAA on this. I would also like to encourage us to make sure, and I'm happy to have the chair do this, that we have some kind of advocacy specifically with our legislative representatives. And that form could be something different than, what is the nice formal response of how it goes to the FAA. I'd like us to see, how do we have, again, through the chair, I'd be happy with, where do we get a chance to do the impassioned or the passionate appeal to our Congress members to say, hey, man, this is really important. Don't let them do this stuff. We wrote this letter, but you got to be out there and really fighting for us. I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost in the fact that we wrote a letter to the FAA.
So I hear you on that one, and I agree. My biggest concern there is, as we heard from Tom earlier, right now, everyone's pretty much focused on how do we manage with COVID-19. But certainly when there is an opportunity, I completely agree. This is worth a conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that too, Lisa, is our agenda item number 5 is pretty specific to the proposed legislation. So to avoid a Brown Act violation, we want to stick to that, and you can take other things up as the chair at some later point in time.
Mm. Okay, Kathy?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I understand Glenn's point, and I agree 100%, about legislative advocacy as well. And going back to what Tom said about their focus is on COVID right now. But I know for the city of Santa Clara, we have lobbyists, and I've spoken to one of them that's in Washington, D.C., who works very closely with Congressman Khanna's office. And when I spoke to him, it was back in January, he was up to date on like recent legislation that like Jackie Spear was proposing about airplane noise and impact. So, I mean, I'm happy to ask our lobbyists to see what they can do to help put information together to get it to our legislative representative to help them move it along if it could help in preparing this letter to the FAA. That's all.
Thanks, Kathy. Other comments? Lydia?
So I was just wondering, is this letter, so I want to first say I agree, that you write the letter and you've kind of summed it up very well. But I was just wondering, are we going to have, is there going to be aviation legal experts that is going to be helping us with looking if there's any other things that we should be concerned about? Pertaining to this certification? Or is that it, that what was mentioned is sufficient? Or was Steve gonna perhaps provide more, that there might be things that we should be furthermore concerned about, or is it just us?
I think it's us and Steve. And what I was thinking is, if I draft something, I would be looking to Steve to add the technical information behind it, in case I've mischaracterized it, to make sure it's on point, and that nobody can poke holes at the arguments that we're making. I don't think we have access to a legal resource at this point, unless somebody knows of one that we have.
So in asking Steve then, is there anything else that we should be adding to this, or is this sufficient given he's heard all the comments from the general public and their concerns and so forth? So is this sufficient?
Olivia, I think it's sufficient, and in my conversations with Lisa about the committee's work leading up to this meeting, I characterized it much as Glenn did, as I saw it. This is a pretty simple issue, and the Roundtable's already taken a stand on it, and that is, we don't want any backsliding. We want these aircraft to meet stage 5 or better standards, and my understanding is that's what this committee has just agreed to, and that's what this letter should reflect. So I don't see it as having a great deal of technical information in it, but certainly the historical information that Mary Jo talked about should be in there.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in order to move forward, as Steve said, we would need a motion to direct me to write a letter on behalf of the Roundtable, working with Steve on that. I'd send it out to this committee, and then it would go to the Roundtable for approval. And I guess I would add, in at the same time, when we go to the Roundtable, we would also say we think it's important to also talk with our representatives, but we're going to wait until the appropriate time to do that, given their focus on COVID-19. Glenn.
If you're ready, I'm willing to make that motion for you if you want.
Thanks.
So I move that we authorize the chair to write the letter with all the comments that has been included here, with appropriate advocacy at the appropriate time.
Lydia?
I'll second.
Okay. So we probably need to do a roll call vote. Ed?
Aye.
Lydia?
I already spoke. Oh, yes, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Glenn?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. And I think Michelle has dropped off. So that's 5, 4, and 1 absent. Thank you all. Okay, moving on to item 6. And again, I think we need to move through this pretty quick. I know many of us had wanted to participate in the press conference that the county had today, but we're running a little bit behind here. So item 6 is future agenda items. And I've made this is really just to help us plan what we're going to talk about in future meetings and prioritize it. There's a lot we could do, but as we've said, we kind of need to focus. And I'll throw out the list of things that I've heard. If you could all jot these down. I don't have them on a PowerPoint or anything, so I've been taking notes during this meeting. And then if we want to add to that list and then talk about priorities real quick. Or maybe we have a different process depending upon the time. But there are 15 bills that have been introduced into the House. Maybe taking a look at those. FAA reauthorization bill, a status update and any progress that's been made on those or any reports or anything that have been generated. The airplane bailout work that's going on. Airport expansion plans, a calendar. Those are the ones I had written down, but I would add to that that we would take a look at what we would like to do in terms of proactive legislation. And as Glenn said, not necessarily coming up with the exact wording, but the ideas of what we would like to see. Are there any other items that folks on the committee, let's just get the list out first and then talk about priority or if any of those should be dropped. I don't see any hands from the committee members. Now I do. Lydia?
So thank you for all of that. And the reauthorization bill, you have that. But I was just kind of wondering, do we know of other committees that have already started that so we don't have to do the entire work again? So if there's some other committee that has done that, maybe Steve can guide us to it so we can start working on, so we can just use that to get a starting point. The other things are, how best to work with congressional staff, the representatives and the senators for new legislation, or getting existing legislation that has been completed that we might want to see if we can do amendments on it or add more to it. So not only to reinvent something, but I was just wondering about that. And yeah, I'm sorry. You said most of them, so thank you.
Glenn?
I want to follow on to Lydia's point here is about how can we be more effective that, and how do we work with our Congress people, and also how do we better understand the enemy we're working against, which is really this industry. I want to make sure we're realistic about what our ability is and how our voice carries. There's a lot of legislative advocacy that's being done already to reduce air noise problems. We're just another, spit in the breeze. So if just because we write a letter doesn't make it, because it came from Santa Clara, then Santa Clara County and Santa Cruz County, oh, now everybody's going to start to listen. I think we need to think through that a little bit to go, how do we make our voice more effective? And it's not just teaming up with other legislative committees. I mean, they've already all been doing that. I mean, how do we think outside the box of getting something so we can really make a difference. And that's where I think it goes back to the comment I'm glad you mentioned of here, we need to be pushing a legislative agenda that says our success criteria is Mr. and Mrs. Congress, you need to change the FAA so that they now have to care about noise impact on the ground. Until that one fundamental thing is done, all this other stuff is just, we're fighting against a machine and we don't have the right tools. Until we get that tool, we're not going to be able to be more effective. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear, but there you go.
Kathy?
Hi, Lisa. Okay, so you mentioned the 15 bills, the legislative bills, and I was wondering, are eight of them Jackie Spears bills, or I forget if it was 7 or 8. Does that include her bills?
It does.
It does. Okay, great. So that means there have been more since, and
actually
again,
there was, I went and took a look at all these. There were a bunch introduced before hers.
Oh.
And the list you gave me only included hers, but at the NOISE, N-O-I-S-E, that organization,
Yep.
their meeting at the NLC, they had the list of all the bills.
Great. Okay. Yeah. But like I said before, because of the fact that, our legislators are preoccupied, obviously, with COVID right now. We're paying our representatives, our lobbyists, Washington, Sacramento, to, just follow up on these issues. So again, I'm happy to reach out, and if you send me the list or see if we can get updates on what's going on, I'm happy to do that to help move along. But also, I agree with Glenn again that we need to, we need to find ways to advocate, beyond our legislators. I don't know when Washington will be in a place where some of these committees are meeting again. Do we need to go? Do we need to have some of our representatives or representatives from other roundtables to collaboratively go to some of these congressional meetings and to talk about, this is why you need to think about what you're asking of the FAA. Just going to that level, I don't think it's beyond our scope, but I think it's something that could possibly have an impact as well. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. So since last time I could not see if a committee member had their hand up. Ed, do you have your hand up at all? I'll just ask.
I'll be really quick. I didn't have my hand up. I pretty much agree with what's been said. I think you presented a good list. I think Glenn's got a valid point. I'm not sure how we accomplish that, but it sure is something worth asking. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so before we go into a committee discussion, I'm going to open this up for public input. And I see at least a couple people with their hands up. And speakers will have 2 minutes. And let's start with Jennifer from Sunnyvale.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. A couple things I wanted to mention. This may not be the time to mention them, but when we are talking about the airline bailouts, we definitely do need to talk about that and be advocating as far as vortex generators and such on that. There are billions of dollars at stake here. I also wanted to mention something about, and again, this may not be the place to do it, but on the agenda packet, I noticed that it wasn't updated with the recent public comments. So I only have a 36-page document that I can see, and none of the comments from Mary Jo or me or Robert seem to be in there. So I was a little confused as to what some of the members were speaking about, because I couldn't see what those documents were. The other thing is on Zoom itself, I could not see the entire panel. Like Robert, I can only see one person at a time. And then I'll talk in the next issue about a little bit about the supersonic letter, but I'll leave that at the next agenda item. Thank you.
So I believe the comments we received or the input we received from the public is also posted on the Roundtable's website. I saw it there. So it might not have been part of the packet, but I saw it posted on the website. Okay, moving on to Darlene.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How can the legislative committee best get the work done? And I think Glenn and Lydia summarized. One is we have to figure out how to work through the congressionals. I mean, that's what their core competency is around legislation. So we need to understand, first of all, how. The second thing, and it's very strategic, which is what do we focus on? And I can't help to figure out what we should focus on that we could more effectively benefit from Steve's expertise. And, you know, I think we saw it on this call today. I mean, he's one of the leading experts on airplane noise. And by golly, we should make use of this more. So the experience by roundtables across the nation is they don't have time to do research on topics and become experts, nor do they have time to do the initial analysis and interpretation of the rules and the procedures. So it seems like we should try to do a little bit more like the city council models, where the city staff performs analyses and makes recommendations. And the legislative committee could do the same thing with our roundtable consultant, so that on future agendas, we could have Steve present his summary analysis and conclusions as a starting point. But I think moreover, what I want to emphasize on the how is we've spent a year discussing issues and questions on procedures, processes, and so on. I think it would be useful to really have Steve share his perspective on the key areas he heard from the roundtable and propose which one of these, how can we approach moving forward? He has tremendous experience on other roundtables and in this industry. So what should we focus on? I would urge the legislative committee to seek Steve's guidance on, or input to proactively share his expertise and accelerate our own progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Marie Jo.
So I want to, in fact, add to Darlene's comments, and also this will address some comments made earlier by Glenn in the meeting. By no means, this committee should not review all legislation and regulations. I mean, you would be there for 100 years. However, as Darlene mentioned, is once you have a list of the critical issues, and that list is not, you know, so long, then I think you really need to understand, you need to know the key issues behind, and then you shouldn't be writing new legislation, but pointing to the legislation or the regulation is really important, because that's how the game is played. You're much more powerful in your argument to say, we don't want this, and you can say because, and this is the problem with the current legislation, as opposed to say we just want to reduce noise. So, you know, the supersonic example is, we all agree that meeting the stage 5 standards or do better is what we want. But you have a more powerful argument if you say, well, by the way, the FAA in 2018 wrote this memo and concluded they completely changed their decision that they had for 30 years. And by the way, they are not meeting the goal that they stated in that same memo, because then the legislation, the congressional staff can really figure out how to play that in with the FAA. So let's not go to review everything. Let's first, for this committee, identify, and as Darlene said, Steve should be able to provide that summary relatively quickly, and then start pointing, you know, what is the legislation? For instance, ANCA is a very important one. Local governments lost control with ANCA about how to regulate airport traffic. Well, how do we, I mean, this is a major strategic problem. How could it be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Landesman.
Hi, this is Jennifer Landesman, and I would like to, yes, definitely, if Steve is going to do a summary, I would, the email I sent was to focus on the items that the select committee had pointed to, which have to do to noise measurements, metrics, and process. And I think they very succinctly identified items that were high priority to all the input they received during 6 months. So based on that, to look at the things that made law in 2018 and what the status is. So I'll give a specific example. If the FAA does not come back with a neighborhood survey and says anything meaningful about it, and they don't move on the threshold of significance, and we're still getting CADXs and environmental reviews, mainly CADXs, which is a failure to disclose the impact. So while the FAA is changing certifications and getting industry, to advance in order to have global leadership and all that, all the impacts that are being put on populations are hidden. They're not disclosed. They're not just simply whatever, they're literally hiding these impacts as long as this doesn't change. So let's say the FAA says, well, we are only going to model noise, we're not going to measure. Then you have to think about state legislation in order to be able to get airports to measure noise. So wherever the FAA is going to say, we're not going to do it, you've got to turn to the state power in order to be able to do it at the state level. We have people in Southern California very interested in this. So I think, to the point that Mary Jo made at the beginning about coordination, this has to be for federal issues, yes, working with Congress at a national level and at the state level, so that what we need done gets done. And at a very minimal, we really need to let people know what the impacts are. And certainly, as the Select Committee has already written, DNL alone cannot characterize problems of noise on the ground, which
Thank
is
you, Jennifer.
why I believe, yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Robert Holbrook.
I'd like to emphasize coming up with a spreadsheet that identifies the bills that have been introduced before Congress, and also the sections in the FAA Reauthorization Act where Congress called for responses from the FAA. And there's a lot of them. There's many that I haven't seen on anybody's list, many of which interest us. There's a slogan in management I was taught, which is inspect what you expect. And the idea is that if people know you're watching, they tend to be a little bit more responsive. And there were a lot of reports that were called for that could favor folks on the ground in the reauthorization bill. There was little actionable stuff that was required of the FAA, but there were a lot of reports that were called for that could help us. And I think we want to get them in a timely way. Coming up with a list of what was what they are committed or were asked to deliver is the first step with that. The second step then would be to sit down with a list of House bills and the items in the FAA Reauthorization Act and decide which ones we want to put our energy into. We will need to prioritize, and there may be a couple of levels of response, just getting response from the FAA to give us an update, whether they have even provided an update within the time allowed or not. Also, we may want to take more time and engage our congressional representatives who are going to be more interested around the time that the FAA makes a report back to Congress or around the time that a bill comes up for discussion. One point topic, which I would say is not urgent, but is important, and that we have more influence over than many because NASA is here, is drones. There's a huge amount of stuff in the FAA Reauthorization Act on drone regulation, and it would be good for us to look into that, especially as some of that technology is being developed by NASA at Ames. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't see anyone else in the queue. Andy, do you?
No, I've lost my chat window or my participant window. Hold on here. Nope, I don't see anyone else.
Okay, great. So we'll close the public input portion of this item and bring it back to the committee for deciding how we move forward with this. I don't see any hands up, so I guess I know how I think I'd like to move forward with this. In the interest of time and trying to, in terms of time being able to move faster, I would love it if someone could take the input we've received and the list we've received and come up with a plan for what you think of the future agenda items should be. You know, I feel like I heard, and I believe that we do need to focus in order to be effective. The reason I wanted to be on the Ledge Committee is because I think legislation is the way to go to address airplane noise. And so I want to make sure we're being incredibly focused and effective. And to me, what Glenn was saying, you know, how do we work with our legislators and what do we want them to put forward? And how do we help them be successful with the legislation we want them to pass? So coming up with the proactive list of what we would like them to do, I think is the most important thing. I think taking a look at the existing 15 bills that are in the House, we can learn from those. I don't know if any of them are going to go anywhere, but people spent time on them, and maybe there's some stuff we can glean from those. I actually do have a summary of the 15 and where the current status of all of them. I spent some time putting that together. But I would love it if someone could take this. One of the challenges I feel like we have on this roundtable in this committee is versus when we're working on city topics, we're the staff along with Steve, and got some help from Andy and some other folks we're tapping into, but a lot of this does fall to the roundtable and the committee members to do work. So I feel like there's only so much I can dedicate this, just like everybody else. And I don't think I can take on putting this together, given the other things I've committed to. Comments? So, gosh, this Zoom is very different as the host versus a participant. So I don't see among the committee members any hands raised. So Steve, is this something that you could do for us?
Somehow I knew that question would be asked.
Sorry.
Yes, I absolutely could, Lisa.
I'm happy to discuss it with you, make sure we're on the same page. Maybe we can do that. That would be great. I see Kathy.
Lisa, no, I'm sitting here with my leg propped up, wondering, you know, I mean, I would love to jump in and say, yes, I'll be happy to take on. I saw Lydia's hand raised as well, so I don't know if she was going to say this or I'm stealing her thunder, but I would be happy to. I mean, my concern, Steve, we love Steve. He's very knowledgeable, but at the same time too, I know his time is money, and money comes from our budget, and I know we had some budget concerns. So if this is something that, like you just said, you know, a member of the committee could take on, I would be happy to do that in terms of a savings to the committee and moving forward. So Steve, if you don't mind me jumping in, I would be happy to do that.
I would say certainly it's up to the chair. If Lisa, you'd like Kathy to take a shot at that, that's fine.
So I appreciate the comment about ESA is a great resource, but also an expensive resource. Yeah. They do add a lot of value. And so maybe what we could do, Kathy, is have you take a stab at it and then work with Steve and get his input on this.
Great.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is a reason we have a contract.
Yes.
You may use it.
Yeah, Lisa, if I may, this is Andy.
Yeah.
This is an expected expense, and I would appreciate that the members want to worry about the budget and that this is something that we expected to use. And I would also suggest that utilizing Steve at the front end to try to create a structure for how you're going to track legislation is not a bad idea. So, you know, if Councilmember Watanabe would maybe like to work with Steve about what information, that might be another way that you could attack this issue.
Okay, that sounds good. And then could just going forward just be like maybe a subcommittee of this committee, or just for follow-up?
Well, I think depending upon what the committee decides to do, we would figure out the best approach. I think this is just what are the priorities for this group? I feel like I've heard at least 2 things that are very high priority, and that's figuring out how we be effective and what do we want our federal and maybe state legislators to work on. And yes, we also want to see what's already in the queue, and I'm happy to send that to you and the current status of it. But is there anything else beyond that, and how do we prioritize this? To me, coming up with what's the proactive legislation we would like to do is very critical. I believe, just like Glenn said, we need to focus. We don't have a ton of resources. We don't have a ton of time. Let's figure out how we be most effective.
I agree. Okay. I'm happy to go in that direction, working with Steve and moving forward with priorities.
Okay. So I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Other comments from Lydia?
So I'm just gonna say I agree. I think Steve helped us a lot last year in setting up the roundtable and getting our work plan and strategic plan going. So moving forward, I'm really looking forward to having Steve show us his expertise and where he's like where his technical abilities as well as legislative guidance for us. So I'm very happy that he is going to take on, this future agenda item thing. And thank you, Kathy, for volunteering to help him. But I just want to say I'm in agreement.
Okay. Do you want to make a motion? Or is there any other comments? I don't see any other hands up.
Hey, Lisa.
Yeah.
This isn't an action item, so I don't know. I mean, this sounds like an assignment to me as opposed to needing a motion.
Thank you.
You bet.
You're right. Thanks.
You bet.
Okay, so the action item is Kathy and Steve will work together on this. I'm happy to share the information, and the next time we meet, we'll have this one on the agenda. Okay, we are a little bit after noon. Item 7 was any reports or anything, anything anyone wants to share, things they've heard or seen that they think this committee should know about. This is the time. We will not act on any of this, but it might be good to just know if there's anything anyone wants to share. I don't see any hands raised. I don't know if folks, the only thing I had is, I don't know if folks are aware that at the NLC meeting in Washington, DC, there was a group of council members who met with actually the DOT. I was not one of them, but they sent an email saying that they learned that Boston and other airports nearby are working with MIT to build dispersion into NextGen in the Boston area. I thought that was really interesting. I'm very interested in learning more about that one, but I just thought I'd share that. Anything else from committee members? Okay, I don't see any hands up. So is there anything that any member of the public would like to announce? And I don't see any hands up. Andy, are there any that you're seeing via other routes?
No, I'm.
Okay,
Hands.
great, thanks. There's certainly a lot of things to check here.
I know, right?
Whew, yeah. Okay. Then we will close the public comment portion of item 7, and the last item is adjourn. So we'll adjourn this meeting at 12:08, and I'm looking forward to the next meeting of this group. Thank you all very much for participating. Thanks to all the members of the public who participated. Andy, thanks for your help. I see Christina on there. She's helping me in the background. Steve, thanks for being here. And I look forward to this being a great committee. Thank you all.
Nice job.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Stay well, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Be well.